The Healer, The Healing Work of Mary Baker Eddy, compiled and arranged by David Keyston. Part 5, Sixth Continuation, number 260. Mrs. Eddy possessed the ability to read the unspoken thoughts of her pupils. For example, a student called at her home for an interview and was told that Mrs. Eddy would see her in a few moments. While the student was looking out of the window, as she waited for Mrs. Eddy, she saw an intoxicated man across the street. She began to ponder the case and asked herself, "Where is that seeming error? Am I drunk, or is that man drunk? Is the error in me, or is it in him?" Immediately, Mrs. Eddy, who had entered the room unobserved, said aloud, "No, that error is not in your thought." Number 261. One morning, Mrs. Eddy was examining us in her study, putting various questions to us. Finally, she said, "Dear ones, you have answered well. Now that you have been so patient with Mother, what can she do for you?" We were all surprised at the question, but Mr. Strang, Louis Strang, at one time a secretary to Mrs. Eddy, I believe it was, spoke up finally, "Mother, will you prophesy for us?" Her face clouded for just an instant, and then she said, "To perform the demonstration of prophecy always includes a temptation of animal magnetism." Mrs. Eddy's term for mortal mind, or another word for evil, the devil. Now, I have always found this rule of help. When you are about to prophesy, always handle animal magnetism first, and then you will find the times in his hands, and all need for prophecy will be gone. Why? Because faith in God will have taken its place. But the next day she referred to this again and said, "My dear students, God has told me this much for you. At the end of this 20th century, Christian Science will be the only universally acknowledged religion in the world, because the other religions have no demonstrating basis. But much work remains undone. Much self-denial waits for us all before this end can be fulfilled. The main thing is for us to handle MAM, malicious animal magnetism, that would make us fold our hands till this manifests itself. But truth demands work, work, work. Never forget that. Number 262. Another example of Mrs. Eddy's effective healing work in raising Calvin Fry from death took place in 1905. George Kinter recorded the following account in his Reminiscences. What is also interesting is that Calvin had been dead for well over an hour before being revived. One winter night, the 3 rings, Mrs. Eddy utilized a bell system which rang in the appropriate room to request the presence of the individual she needed, which were Fry's special summons to Mrs. Eddy's room, sounded throughout the house unheeded. Then Kinter's 5-ring signal rang out sharply, and he flew to answer it. Taking a shortcut through Fry's room, he was surprised to see Calvin in a chair, but apparently unconscious. Mrs. Eddy, apprised of this, sent him back to rouse Fry. But Kinter now discovered that the motionless figure was stone cold and rigid, with no perceptible pulse, breath, or other sign of life. By this time, Mrs. Eddy had rung for Laura Sargent, who arrived to find her already out of bed and advancing in her nightdress toward Calvin's room, regardless of the icy cold of the house. Paying not the slightest attention to Kinter's and Mrs. Sargent's protests, Mrs. Eddy bent over the sitting figure and began at once to make bold, audible declarations of truth. For more than an hour she continued to call upon Fry, in one way or another, to wake up and be the man God made. Mrs. Sargent, meanwhile, had rung for the maid, who brought a double blanket in which they wrapped Mrs. Eddy, while Kinter, with an aching back, supported her in the half-stooping position in which she bent over Fry's inert form, completely oblivious of what they were doing for her or of anything except the need to rouse Calvin. At last he moved slightly and began to murmur. They could pick out broken phrases. "Don't call me back. Let me go. I am so tired." To which Mrs. Eddy replied that she would indeed continue to call him back from the dream state in which he had been, that he loved life and its activities too well to fall asleep, that he was freed from the thraldom of hypnotism and alive to God, his Savior from sin and death. In another half-hour, Calvin had recovered, and everybody went to bed. The next morning, no mention was made of the night's events. Fry was in his usual place, and life proceeded normally. From John. Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary, and her sister Martha. When Jesus heard that, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby." Now Jesus loved Martha, and her sister, and Lazarus. When he had heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Then after that saith he to his disciples, "Let us go into Judea again. Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep." Then said his disciples, "Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well." Howbeit Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking rest in sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, "Lazarus is dead." Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. Now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She saith unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. And when she had so said, she went her way, and called Mary her sister secretly, saying, The Master is come, and calleth for thee. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly, and came unto him. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit, and was troubled, and said, Where have ye laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then said the Jews, Behold, how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Jesus therefore again, groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, Take ye away the stone. Jesus saith unto her, Said I not unto thee, that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes, and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. And I knew that thou hearest me always. But because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus saith unto them, Loose him, and let him go. Number 263. Edward Norwood assisted Mrs. Eddy in putting together the chapter Fruitage in Science and Health. During his involvement with this, he relates a fascinating experience, one which was repeated during the building of the Mother Church. It may be of interest to note that during this time, my watch, a very good one, began to gain in time, until it was 3 hours a day. Regulating did it no good, so I let it go, and as soon as the work was finished, it resumed its normal condition. Mr. Armstrong told me he had the same experience in the building of the Mother Church. And the jeweler told him, It is you, not the watch. From Revelation. And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head. And his face was, as it were, the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open. And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth, and cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roareth. And when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven, and the things that therein are, and the earth, and the things that therein are, and the sea, and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished, as he hath declared to his servants the prophets. Number 264. Because of the awesome healing work performed by Christian scientists and the phenomenal growth of Christian Science, Mrs. Eddy and her church garnered much attention from the newspapers of the day. Yellow journalism was rampant in her day, and because of the unjust attacks upon her, there was much to meet in setting the record straight. As always, Mrs. Eddy responded with love, constantly blessing those who would harm her. In the days when our dear leader was being held up for ridicule by the pulpit and press because of ignorance of Christian Science, a newspaper reporter called to see her and asked her to tell him what a Christian Science treatment was. He intended to quote her in the press, and then ridicule her words and ideas. Mrs. Eddy paused several moments and then answered, A Christian Science treatment is an absolute acknowledgement of the ever-presence of infinite perfection. The reporter thought over Mrs. Eddy's words, but could make nothing out of them, so did not quote her and ridicule her. Years later, the same newspaper man lay dying with a serious throat infection. He could not speak, and his wife thought him unconscious. She was talking with someone in an adjoining room when she was startled to hear her husband repeating slowly, in a perfectly clear, strong voice, A Christian Science treatment is an absolute acknowledgement of the ever-presence of infinite perfection. He had remembered what Mrs. Eddy told him, and in his hour of extremity it came back to him with a spiritual realization that healed him completely. From Hebrews. For the word of God is quick and powerful, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, and of the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. From Isaiah. so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. Number 265. As it became evident that a greater attack, this was during the time of the next friend's suit, than ever before was building up, Mrs. Eddy wrote Edward Kimball, "To be honest and wise is the acme of Christian Scientists' attainment at this period. I pray importunately for wisdom." 3 years earlier, young Calvin Hill, after one of his frequent trips to Pleasant View, had written her that the calm assurance that God good is the only power, which I have always seen in you from my first visit, has given me renewed strength and confidence that honesty, fidelity, and truth lived will ultimately triumph. Now, on February 21st, he wrote her that her last talk with him a few days before had brought him an instantaneous healing of an unnamed difficulty. Calvin Hill added, "This manner of healing is on par with the accounts of the way Jesus healed." Number 266. A healing which I recall with much interest occurred in the year 1907, at the time of the next friend's suit, when many newspapers were sending their reporters to Concord in the hope of securing interviews with Mrs. Eddy. Since it would have taken nearly all her time if she had seen all these representatives of the press, she appointed me, Irving C. Tomlinson, as a receiver and giver of messages. At this time, there were 3 or 4 reporters particularly determined to see Mrs. Eddy. They had been sent to Concord to dig up the truth about her. The orders from the city desk were positive. They were, "Use whatever methods are necessary, but get the facts." If Mrs. Eddy was dead and someone was impersonating her, if she was mentally incompetent and physically in ill health, they were to bring back the story, sparing no one. As one of these men remarked later, we hoped that something of a sensational nature would be uncovered. If Mrs. Eddy was merely living in a saintly retirement, working and praying for mankind, it was not news. But if any of the other rumors about her were true, it would be a great story. This man said they were a belligerent lot of old-timers, and they hoped and expected to dig up a lot of scandal, that they were news hounds baying on the trail. Having been in Concord for some time, covering the occurrences surrounding the suit, and trying to get whatever information they could about Mrs. Eddy, this reporter said they were all greatly amazed at the kind and loving treatment accorded them. If ever anyone has a right to hate someone, surely the Christian Scientists had a right to hate us, he said. We had no reverence and no decency. We did not believe anything but the worst about anybody, and we wanted, if possible, to hold Mrs. Eddy up to scorn and ridicule, to expose and denounce her. The chief man among this group, representing a big New York newspaper, was known as a particularly hard-boiled reporter and a steady drinker. He had been afflicted for some years with a cancerous growth of the throat, which was extremely painful and at times overwhelmed him completely. One evening, as they were all sitting in his room at the Eagle Hotel, drinking and smoking, bored with their stay, this man was suffering with his throat. He had lost his voice entirely and was unable to speak a word. Mrs. Eddy had asked me to call these men by telephone and inform them that it was impossible for her to see them. But she cautioned me at the same time, be sure to ask for the leading man and speak directly to him. God told her who to talk to. The telephone rang, and one of the younger reporters answered the call. According to instructions, I asked to speak to the head man, whose name he mentioned, but was told that this man was too ill to come, could not come, and could not speak if he did come to the telephone, and could not speak anyway. Remembering Mrs. Eddy's instruction, I said, "Tell him to come to the telephone. He can hear what I say even if he can't talk." Accordingly, the suffering newspaper man came to the telephone, showing decided anger, as I was later informed. He listened for a few moments. Those in the room, of course, could not hear what was being said. But when this man turned away from the telephone, he not only could speak perfectly, but was healed. The healing stirred these men. They sat around looking at each other, unable to comprehend what had happened, and more startled by it than anything else. They had, of course, heard that Christian scientists claimed to heal the sick, and they knew that their comrade had been healed. One can imagine the consternation and excitement produced by this sudden transformation of one of their number. These men had believed Mrs. Eddy to be only a humbug, and the reputed healings of Christian Science to be a great hoax. Their whole position was overthrown by this proof offered before their very eyes. They packed their bags and left. Some years later, a relative of this man called at my office in Boston and gave me the following message. "My uncle requested me to see you and to tell you that in his last days he turned to Christian Science, and he knew that he owed a debt of gratitude to Mrs. Eddy for his healing in Concord." From Matthew. "For the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour, and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Again he went out about the 6th and 9th hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out, and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all the day idle? They say unto him, Because no man hath hired us. He saith unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that shall ye receive. So when even was come, the Lord of the vineyard saith unto his steward, Call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first. And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny. But when the first came, they supposed that they should have received more, and they likewise received every man a penny. And when they had received it, they murmured against the good man of the house, saying, These last have wrought but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden and heat of the day. But he answered one of them and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst not thou agree with me for a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way. I will give unto this last even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? So the last shall be first, and the first last, for many be called, but few chosen. Number 267. On several occasions, I, Miss Adelaide Still, saw Mrs. Eddy subdue a storm, and I well remember the first time that I witnessed this demonstration. It was the 3rd of August, 1907, between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m. The sky was overcast with heavy clouds, and it was very dark. Mrs. Eddy sat in her chair in the study at Pleasant View, watching the clouds with a smile and a rapt expression on her face. It seemed to me that she saw beyond the storm and her present surroundings, and I do not think that she was conscious of my presence. In a few moments, the clouds broke and flecked, and the storm was dissolved into its native nothingness. About a half an hour later, I had occasion to go to her room again when she said to me, "Did you see the sky?" I said, "Yes, Mrs. Eddy." Then she said, "It," meaning the cloud, "was never there. God's face was never clouded." From Mark. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. And there were also with him other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him, and say unto him, "Master, carest thou not that we perish?" And he arose, and rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, "Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Number 268. Chestnut Hill was her home for the last 3 years of her sojourn here, located in Brookline, Massachusetts. Mrs. Eddy was nearer the everyday affairs of her church. While this was a necessary move for her because of business and tax reasons at the time, it broke her heart to have to leave her beloved Pleasant View. Nonetheless, demonstrations of her nearness to God resulted in many proofs of her healing power and illustrations of God's law, refuting the claims of mortal law and material sense. At one time, a new student of science and health had just received a healing, and her thought being so moved, she rushed to Boston to see Mrs. Eddy and thank her for her work. Upon reaching her home, she was disappointed to find that Mrs. Eddy had become too busy to see visitors. Although she could not see the author of Science and Health, she asked to view a portrait that she heard hung in one of the rooms of Mrs. Eddy's home. As she was ushered into the parlor, she found herself face to face with the beloved woman she had come to meet. Mrs. Eddy said that she had been extremely busy writing when God impelled her to come downstairs. She did not know why. She lovingly embraced her visitor, and before she left, the woman had enrolled in Mrs. Eddy's next class. Number 269. A man in the landscaping business, who was a student of Christian Science, came east from Kansas City. Mrs. Eddy hired him to come to Chestnut Hill with his crew and do some work on her place. The first day he came all prepared, and Mrs. Eddy would not permit him to start. This experience was repeated the second day. Since this meant a great expense to him, he was disturbed and spent the entire second day in the study of Science and Health. When he arrived at Chestnut Hill the third day, his thought was right, and Mrs. Eddy permitted him to go to work. From 2 Timothy, Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness. Number 270. Adam Dickey, in his memoirs of Mary Baker Eddy, showed how every detail of ordinary life was looked after by Mrs. Eddy. There was a fruit tree on the grounds of Chestnut Hill that was dying, and was slated to be cut down. When Mrs. Eddy heard of it, she directed that it be left and taken care of as best as possible. She took up the situation in Christian Science, and very shortly the tree was again thriving.